The events of respiration that we're going to talk about include pulmonary ventilation, which is the air moving in and out of the lungs. External respiration, which is the exchange in the alveoli of oxygen going into the blood and carbon dioxide coming out of the blood. Then we'll talk about respiratory gas transport. That's how oxygen gets moved to the tissues that need them, and carbon dioxide gets removed as waste from the tissues. And then internal respiration is actually how the oxygen gets out of the blood in the tissues that need it, goes into the cells that need oxygen, and then those cells release carbon dioxide. Breathing is a mechanical process, and really it depends on volume changes in the thoracic cavity. When the volume of the thoracic cavity changes, that changes the pressure that leads to flow of gases to equalize the pressure. So, for example, to breathe in, called inspiration, what happens is muscles contract, the diaphragm contracts to move down into the abdominal cavity, and the intercostal muscles contract to elevate the ribs, making the thoracic cavity bigger volume-wise. When the thoracic cavity is bigger, the volume gets bigger, now the pressure is really low in there. So it allows air to be pulled in from outside in the environment when, because the normal atmospheric pressure is a certain amount. When you make more volume in your lungs, that pressure will just go in. Expiration is kind of the opposite. In regular respiration, those muscles that have been contracted just relax. So the diaphragm moves back up into the thoracic cavity, the ribs relax and settle back down. Now you have a smaller volume in your thoracic cavity, and that small volume is going to increase the pressure, so that squeezes the air out of your lungs, almost like taking a balloon and squeezing on the outside of the balloon, so then everything comes flying out of the opening. So that's how air gets in or out of the lungs. Now, oxygen, the alveoli always have more oxygen in them than the blood does. So there's this concentration gradient where the atmosphere has quite a bit of oxygen, but your body is using up oxygen, so there isn't as much there. So oxygen will diffuse out of the alveoli into the blood, so that the blood has more oxygen. Carbon dioxide, same thing. As blood comes back to the lungs from the body, it's got the waste carbon dioxide it picked up as it came through, and that waste carbon dioxide is higher concentration in the blood, so it will just diffuse across the alveoli into the alveoli. So just the process of having an alveolus that has higher concentration of oxygen in it right next to blood as it's going by the lungs, you constantly get diffusion of oxygen out of the alveoli into the blood and carbon dioxide out of the blood into the alveoli. So that after blood moves on from being right next to the lungs, it's been loaded up with oxygen and depleted of carbon dioxide relative to after it's been anywhere else. So just to illustrate that, say the air in your alveoli has lots of oxygen in this top one, and the blood doesn't have very much, the oxygen will tend to move into the blood until it gets to an equilibrium. And carbon dioxide unloading is kind of the opposite, where the blood has way more carbon dioxide, the air doesn't have so much. So the carbon dioxide will just diffuse across into the air over time until it reaches equilibrium. Although the blood is moving past your lungs so fast that it doesn't necessarily ever get to equilibrium. It's always picking up oxygen, dumping out carbon dioxide down their concentration gradients. Oxygen is transported in the blood inside red blood cells. That's a cool picture of red blood cells attached to a protein molecule called hemoglobin. This is a cartoon of what the hemoglobin looks like. And you can see that it's kind of 4 structures stuck together, and each of those structures has an iron attached to this particular group. See the iron in there? That iron group is where the oxygen attaches. So every hemoglobin can hold on to 4 oxygen, carrying them around. And these red blood cells, the great majority of what's in those red blood cells is just there's big sacs filled with hemoglobin that is able to bind to oxygen and carry it. Now, internal respiration. When you get to the tissues, here's a blood capillary going by a particular tissue. As it goes by the tissue, now the tissue has been working, using oxygen to do whatever that cell is normally doing, and as a byproduct of that, it's made waste, carbon dioxide. So as the blood goes by the tissue cells, it's kind of an opposite situation to the lungs. Now, the tissue cells have very little oxygen and a lot of carbon dioxide, so an opposite kind of diffusion happens. Don't worry about this whole reaction you see here, but the opposite reaction happens, so oxygen leaves the red blood cell and goes into the tissues by diffusion, just because there's more oxygen in the blood now than there is in the tissues. And the tissues have a ton of carbon dioxide, which will leave the tissue cells and go into the blood. So in the tissues, it's the exact opposite reaction, really, of what happens in the lungs because of the concentrations of where oxygen is and where carbon dioxide is. So here's a summary of all that. I'm breathing in air that has a lot of oxygen, very little carbon dioxide. After the exchange has happened in the lungs, now I have less oxygen, more carbon dioxide. As the blood is transported and going to the tissues, I have quite a bit of oxygen, but now it's starting to pick up carbon dioxide. Still, as I get to the tissue cavities, now I can give away some of that oxygen from the blood to the tissues that need it, and the blood picks up some waste, carbon dioxide. So now the blood has been depleted of oxygen, it's picked up some carbon dioxide, so now it's taken back to the lungs where that carbon dioxide diffuses out and more oxygen diffuses in. So what influences how deeply you breathe in and how fast you breathe? There are some physical factors. For example, if your body temperature increases, you will also breathe more rapidly. When you're exercising, you will breathe more rapidly. When you're talking or coughing, it affects breathing. You can consciously think, okay, I want to breathe fast, or I want to hold my breath. You can also, your emotions can affect your breathing. If you get really upset, you can start breathing more rapidly. If you're really depressed, it can actually slow down your respiratory rate. The chemical factors, though, really are the most important. There is a certain level of carbon dioxide in your blood that will trigger a center in your brain that says, okay, you have to breathe. No choice. So that's why you can hold your breath for a certain period of time, but then your brain will override it and say, okay, you have to take a breath now. And what drives it is the high level of CO2 in your blood. What are some of the problems that you can have with breathing? Well, diseases that affect that exchange of gases in the lungs are called COPDs, or chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases. Some of the common ones can be a continual bronchial irritation and inflammation, like in chronic bronchitis, where you have lots of mucus so that it makes the wall thicker, so oxygen and carbon dioxide can't be exchanged as easily. Emphysema is almost the opposite. The alveolar walls get destroyed, broken down, so that now there isn't much surface, and even when it heals by fibrosis, and I have scar tissue there, and the scar tissue is thicker, and you can't get diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide across that. So it ends up stopping oxygen, carbon dioxide transport, and you have respiratory failure. The respiratory system is one of the very last to be developed. In the fetus, lungs are filled with fluid, and in fact, they're, the amniotic fluid can kind of just go in and out of the lungs. So at birth is really the first time a child takes a breath, and that first breath is really amazing, because now you have to take these alveoli that have been filled with water and try to inflate them with air. Well, if you've ever tried to blow up a balloon that has water in it, like if you spit in it too much, it clings together so tightly it's really hard to blow it open. And that's the role of surfactant. So surfactant is like, it stops the water from holding the walls of the alveoli closed, so they're easier to blow open. If a child's born prematurely, they don't have enough surfactant yet, so getting them to breathe on their own is really hard, because forcing those alveoli open are very hard. So if a woman's going into premature labor, they'll actually give her steroids to try to get the baby to make surfactant early so that they can actually breathe when they're born.